Hello and welcome to this chess opening video. So what do you think is the best chess opening? I think that's an interesting question. Probably everyone has their own opinion. Feel free to leave comments at any time with what you think is the best chess opening. But people have different opinions. They might say the Lopez opening, with black. Maybe they'll say the Sicilian defense. But I think it really depends on your playing style. Somebody that's more aggressive might think the best chess opening is an attacking opening, or even a gambit chess opening where they give up some material in exchange for piece development or an attack. Somebody that's more defensive or like strategic play, they might like a d4 opening, Queen's Gambit. But no matter what you pick, even if it's e4 or d4, the game can then be steered into something more attacking or more defensive depending on how you play. So if we look at this database and see what is played the most, that may be one way you could tell what the best opening is. According to this database, e4 is played the most, and Bobby Fischer, the former world chess champion and one of the greatest chess players of all time, he actually stated that e4 is best by test. So he felt that pawn to e4 here was the best opening for white. But he was an attacking player. A more defensive player might think the best opening would be d4. Or if somebody likes to play more strategically, they might also like c4 or even bringing one of the knights out first. And we see that today, arguably the best player in the world, Magnus Carlsen, he plays all different openings. And another way you could determine the best opening is what might surprise your opponent the most. Perhaps you pick an opening that you're familiar with and they have no clue how to play this opening. Well, you'll have an advantage. And, that could help you play better against that opponent. All right, so we'll take a look at some of the different openings. According to the computer, e4, or this database, e4 is played the most here. And then the biggest response is the Sicilian defense with c5 here. So, if you look at a database, you can kind of determine what the best openings are by what people play the most because they have more success. Here, what is played most often next? Well, it looks like knight to f3 by far, with 600 and some thousand times this was played versus the second move, knight to c3. So this move is played way more often than bringing the other knight out. So perhaps this could be considered best, or at least one of the best openings. So then, how would you continue here? It looks like d6 is played the most. Bringing this out. This doesn't look like it does a whole lot, but it prevents this pawn from just pushing forward without any consequences if you bring your knight out here. So, especially beginners and intermediate players out there, some of you are thinking, well, I have to learn all these different openings and memorize the variations because I don't want to lose right off in the opening. So why should I study a lot of middle game and especially end game strategy and tactics if I don't even make it through the opening? So that's a good point, where you might want to spend time learning different openings. But there is such a maze of variations in different openings that you could just study forever, your whole life, and still be learning openings. So, especially when you're starting out, I would recommend you just pick one good move for white and then just figure out what to do in the responses to that opening. And then the same for black. Just find one good move for each opening by white, and just try and go one move deeper into your openings each game and figure out what you did wrong. But then I would recommend more study time on end games, tactics, especially strategy, just other areas of the game, so you're not spending all your time on the opening part of chess. All right, so what is played next here? It looks like d4 is the most played move, and then capture, knocking out these two, preventing white from having both of these central pawns, and then you would capture to maintain equality here in material. Now, if we look at this position, white has more space in the center and a knight developed, but black does have two central pawns versus white's only one. And so here, knight to f6 is played most often, attacking the pawn. And this is what I was talking about. Now that d6 was played earlier, this pawn can't push forward and harass the knight. So the pawn is protected. And then what is played most often? a6. So here we have the Najdorf variation. And if you go by the most often played openings, well, this is something else to consider in what you think the best chess opening is. I would say the best chess opening is what is comfortable for you to play, and that's determined by your chess style and your level as well. A beginner needs something that's less complicated than an advanced player that knows a lot more about strategy, or somebody with a better memory might be able to memorize and just remember more complicated lines, such as this Najdorf variation, which can be very complicated. So, Bobby Fischer, he played this Sicilian Najdorf, but he was known to have an outstanding memory. Apparently, he could listen to a conversation in a foreign language and repeat, back a conversation in a foreign language and not even know, what the person was saying. He could just remember it, and that helped Bobby Fischer play more complicated openings. So, for a beginner, you want something that's a little more simple. So here, there are different moves that are pretty close. Most often is bishop to g5 being played, with bishop to e3 being the second most played move. All right, so before I dive into the Sicilian defense the whole time here, let's go back to the beginning and look, because the question was, what is the best chess opening? Well, as I mentioned, it depends on your style. If you like to attack, e4 is a great opening, and that's because it usually leads to more open positions. We saw in that Sicilian defense, it was more open, and that means there's room for the pieces to maneuver and attack, and there's a little bit less strategy and maneuvering, which you might get in a queen pawn to d4 opening. But before I go to the queen pawn opening, let's look at a few more possibilities in this e4 opening here. So the second most played move is e5 here. So what does that accomplish? Well, it's similar to c5, but what's the difference? They both prevent this pawn from just pushing forward here, because we see this is still possible. It's number 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth most played move, only played 4,500 times. So you can push this pawn, but if you push the pawn to here, the knight, first this pawn will capture, your queen will capture, and then the knight can develop, attacking your queen and sending it running, so white would waste a little bit of time there. All right, so What is played most often? Well, once again, the knight to f3 move, which could support a push of this d pawn to d4 now. And most often played here by far is knight to c6. But, you could play this knight out. You could push this pawn. There are different possibilities here. But most common is this. And now we look at the most often played response by white. And this is the Ruy Lopez opening that I was talking about. So some people say as white, this could be the best opening for white. It just, develops the pieces. It like slowly tries to gain an upper hand, on black. But it depends. There are different ways that this opening can be played. The most often played move is a6 here, pushing this pawn and attacking the bishop. But this knight could be played instead, which is the second most played move. And then you would have, what is that, the Berlin defense, I believe. So let me take a look. Yes, the Berlin defense to the Ruy Lopez. And this could lead to a complicated endgame, perhaps. But most often played is this move right here. And then the bishop usually retreats. It is possible to capture the knight, but why give up your bishop pair? So things to consider in the chess openings. You might not be able to remember specific moves, and if you get stuck at some point, another reason why it's not good to just try and memorize opening variations, because at some point you're going to get so far into the game, unless you have a very outstanding memory, you're just going to get to a point where you don't know exactly what to do, and then you have to fall back on general chess principles and general strategy. So another reason it's good to really study strategy and learn general chess principles, because then they can help you in any position when you're not sure what to do. And tactics, no matter how good your strategy and knowledge of principles are, that can all be unraveled with one strong tactic that drops your queen or some other material. All right, so what do we have here? Knight to f6 is usually played. So I'll go through these moves a little bit. White usually castles here the most. So I'll go through the most played moves. Bishop to e7, and then rook to e1. Now I'm not going to explain all these moves. That would be for another video, just on the Ruy Lopez. But we see, these are all book moves. The most often move, of course, is to retreat. And then d6 is usually played, c3. And, these are book moves, and we're already 8 moves in. We can go even further. So castling is usually played. Then h3 to prevent the bishop from pinning the knight to the queen. Then an attack on the bishop. Bishop retreats. But this move also allows c5 to be played to help fight for the center. So white, tries to fight back for the center. Then we have queen to c7, knight. So look at how many book moves there are here. Capture, capture. The knight drops back and adds pressure to this pawn. So here, it looks like quite often the knight just goes back up here, but then a5 threatening to chase this knight. Now we have bishop to e3 helping defend this pawn. The knight is attacked, knight retreats, bishop to d7, rook to c1. The rook is lining up on the queen, so the queen steps to the side, and then knight to f1. So you can see now we're 18 moves in, and these are still book moves. So you can just get lost in all the variations, if you're trying to remember the best opening or one of the best openings and all the moves contained in that opening. So you're better off just learning, especially beginners and intermediate players. Now, once you get up to a chess master level, yes, then you have to memorize more openings because your opponents are going deeper and deeper into the opening themselves. What do we have next here? Well, let me drop back and we'll take another look once again at the e4 move. So one thing about playing the standard lines in e4 openings is that once you play e4, you have a lot to learn. So you have to know what to play against c5. You have to know what to play against e5. And then you don't even have to go into the Ruy Lopez, which was this move here. You could play the second best move, bishop to c4. So, what is the best chess opening? I would say it's whatever you feel most comfortable in. So, if you play something that is not such a book opening where you have to know, a whole bunch of lines, just reams and reams of lines, and you have to memorize so much, you could play the second and third best moves until it goes into territory that is not played as often, and then there's less a chance, especially if you're playing an opponent with a great memory, then there's less a chance they will have memorized specific opening variations. Then we see here, bishop to c5 could be played, knight to f6, even bishop to e7. There's just so many lines. So, back to e4. Once you pick an opening move, well, then you have to know at least, a few moves deep into all the responses. So, c5, the Sicilian defense, the e4 to e5 pawn opening, the king's pawn opening, which can lead to different variations. And then you even have the third most played move, the French defense. So here's where you can rely on opening principles to help you out if you don't know what to play, or you get into a point right in the opening and you're like, I don't usually face this French defense. What should I do? Well, the most played move is d4. Why? Because if your opponent doesn't immediately try and control the center by throwing pawns into the center, you can put your pawns there instead. So if black doesn't do that immediately, well, then he should not waste time, but shortly thereafter he should fight for the center. So this is the most played move, fighting for the center by attacking this pawn. Knight to c3. So now you want to develop your knights early, and then here bishop to b4 is played most often, pinning this knight. And here's where tactics come in. You don't want to just go on autopilot in your openings, because then that can lead to mistakes if you overlook a tactic. So here we have the tactic of the pin on this knight. The knight can't move because it's pinned to the king, and that would be illegal. But the knight was protecting this pawn, which is under attack by black's d4 pawn here. So the most played move is to push this pawn, getting rid of that threat. And then a common strategy in the French defense is to attack the base of the pawn chain here. But white can ignore that for the moment by attacking the bishop, and usually the bishop pair is given up, the pawn recaptures, and then looks like knight to e7 and you're ready to castle. So no matter what openings you pick, the best openings are the ones that you feel comfortable in, that allow you to develop your pieces quickly, and you're not moving pieces more than once unless you're forced to, and you're able to get your king castled to safety quickly. And another good measure of how well you did in the opening is if you're able to get your rooks well placed on an open, half open file, or even somewhere behind pawns that you plan to push forward. All right, so if we go back here, what else do you have to play against when you have e4? c5, the Sicilian defense, was the most played response. And then e5, e6, the French defense, which was this move. And then the fourth most played move is the Caro-Kann, so another opening that you have to worry about. And generally, the center is taken here, so black fights for the center by attacking the pawn. And here you have different options. Once again, the knight can defend the pawn, or you can push forward, gaining space. So this is where strategy comes in. Normally, you don't want to move a piece or a pawn twice in the opening unless you have a good reason. And the reason here is to really gain more space in the center, restrict the opponent's space and cramp their position, and also threaten, if they push this pawn forward here, to keep this pawn from gaining even more space in the future. It could block in their bishop, creating a bad bishop. So that's why this is the most played move. And then here white can just continue to develop a knight. The pawn is pushed, and then the other pawn, or excuse me, the bishop is developed, allowing you to castle quickly. So that is your aim in a good opening. The best chess openings allow you to get your king to safety, get your pieces developed nicely, get your rooks onto squares where they are doing more than just sitting in the corner. Now, some people might argue the best opening is one that leads to a checkmate. Of course, that's true. And maybe you should be attacking more. So if we go back to the beginning, after e4, let's say e5 is played, knight to f3 is most often played, but you could pick something less played like f4, a gambit, where if they take this, which is the most played move, now you just develop a piece. And what have you done here? You've gotten rid of a central pawn and pulled it to the side in exchange for one of your less valuable pawns. g5 is usually played here. And then it looks like h4. So already the game is getting a little more complicated. Now the knight is under attack. It looks like usually this knight jumps up here to the center, targeting this weakened pawn, but also attacking this unprotected pawn. So now knight to f6 protects, and then we have a bishop piling up on the pawn here. So this move blocks, and not wanting to give up the bishop pair, instead of capturing with the bishop, the pawn captures, and now we have bishop developing, and the king is ready to possibly castle on the king side, but his position is weakened here with these pawns thrown forward. Now, d4 is most played, so what is played next? It looks like this move, threatening to attack the rook. That can be ignored perhaps with this move, queen to e7, but you get the idea. The game can go into a crazy opening such as this, and if this happens, you might not know what is going on in the position, and then you have to just fall back on strategy and, more importantly, tactics. Here we see the queen is pinning this knight to the king, and the pinned piece is attacked by the bishop. This pawn could threaten to move forward and capture the pinned knight. So here, usually a check is played. The king moves instead of blocking with the pawn or the bishop, and then castling, and the king is brought out to safety away from this pin action by the queen. All right, so before this video goes on forever, let's take another look at some options instead of e4. d4 can be played. So what is the difference between bringing the pawn out in front of your king and the pawn in front of your queen? Well, the queen pawn openings tend to be more strategical and closed in nature. It looks like the most common response is knight to f6 instead of bringing this pawn here to d5. And why is this knight to f6 move most played? Probably because of its flexibility. You have options. You can still play d5. You could play a King's Indian defense, after pushing this pawn here and fianchettoing the bishop. So it gives black different options and doesn't let white know what they're planning yet. So the most often played move now is c4, because e4, if that's played, the knight could just capture. So if you can't place your two central pawns on d4 and e4, the next best thing might be to place one central pawn in the middle and have a flank pawn also attacking the center. So here it looks like e6 is played most often, and then knight is developed. So after you develop your pawns in the center, you want to get those knights moving, usually before the bishops because they're slower. But there are exceptions. Here the bishop is developed before the other knight because the bishop is pinning the knight, and now the king is ready to castle. So the best chess openings also allow you to play moves that accomplish more than one thing. Here you get your pieces out quickly. The knight and the bishop are developed off the back rank. The king is already ready to castle to safety and bring the rook closer to the center. You're pinning a valuable knight, which is helping. This is helping indirectly influence the center because you're pinning this knight to the king, and so it's not really doing much. Now this knight could possibly jump here to e4 and attack the knight, and the knight cannot capture because it's pinned by the bishop. So most often played here is just e3, fortifying the center and making room for the other bishop to be developed. And here castling, and then bishop to d3 to discourage the knight from jumping here, or it would be captured. And then d5. Finally, black starts fighting for the center, and that's ignored for the moment with another knight developing, and white is ready to castle. And then it looks like c5. So we see a lot of openings. The best openings fight for the center of the board while developing pieces quickly. So another important thing to remember when you're trying to consider what is the best chess opening. All right, let's go back to the beginning and look at another option for d4. The second most played move is d5. And then here, most often played by far, 200 and almost 250,000 times versus 72,000 by the second most played move, which would be that. So c4 is played most often, and here we have the Queen's Gambit, which is a very good opening, one of the best chess openings, and also named after a very good Netflix series. If you haven't watched it, The Queen's Gambit, I would recommend that if you like chess shows or movies. Searching for Bobby Fischer, that was another great movie out there. All right, so here, what is played most often? Well, it looks like c6, which declines the gambit. You could capture this pawn, pulling your central pawn off to the side and possibly allowing white to place both his pawns in the center. And here we have the Slav defense, and knight to f3 is played most often. So once again, we see this theme of placing the pawns here in the center. If you can't place both of them, well, then you might be able to place a flank pawn up beside your other central pawn, and then you want to get these knights developed quickly. So most played move for black is also developing the knight. Other knight develops, and here there are options. E6 is played the most often, fortifying the center. White does likewise, fortifying the central d4 pawn. And then the other knight is developed here, which controls the central square, maybe getting ready to push this pawn. It backs up the other knight. If this knight decides to jump forward, the other knight can take its place. So I'll go a few more moves into this. Queen develops off the back rank, helping control the central square. Bishop develops, likewise for white. Now we have castling, and finally some action in the center. Wrong side. Capture, and capture by the bishop. B5 chases the bishop and it retreats, giving black time to develop and aim at the king side. Finally, a rook is developed towards the center. Queen develops, so now the rooks are connected and have more freedom to move. So remember what I said, the best chess openings allow you to get your rooks well placed coming out of the opening. So it looks like E4 is played most often, E5. Now the other bishop is developed. Capture, rook captures, knight to E5, blockading this pawn and attacking. So here we have a capture, wrecking the pawns on the king side. G3 is played to block the scope of this battery. And now, bishop to C5, attacking here. Rook retreats. Queen creates another battery, attacking here now. And the rook comes over to protect. All right, so you get the idea. The rook is fighting for this open file, and black, the second played move here is to bring this rook, which is doing nothing, over to the center to help fight for the center. All right, back to see if there's anything else with D4 that we should cover. We saw that the knight is the most flexible move, so that's why it's played most often. And then D5, the second most played move. And after that, you have other moves like E6 or even D6, even G6. So different pawn moves. But we'll take a look at the third most played move, E6. Now, this allows you to either bring this pawn into the center, or you could even bring this one in, but that's the third most played move. Second is to just bring your knight up. But I would recommend, if your opponent doesn't control the center, definitely think about bringing your central pawns up. You could bring, the most played move is this right here. Why? Because black is probably intending to play this at some point, and then you can capture the more valuable central pawn with your less valuable flank pawn. Getting a little bit of an advantage. You'll be left with two central pawns, and if he recaptures with this pawn, black will only have one central pawn. All right, anyway, before the video drags out, let's try and wrap it up. So we saw E4 and D4, the most played moves. After that, what do we have? Third most played is knight to F3. And it's kind of like when black played knight to f6 here. This is a very flexible move in the opening. You know that it's good to bring, well, if you know your chess opening principles, you know it's good to develop your knights before the bishops, and knights are almost always well placed here and here. So both of these knights developing to f3 and c3, they're almost always well placed there because they control all these squares in the center here. This knight controls that, and if a knight was here, it would control the other squares. So here, knight to f6 is most often played. Once again, maybe waiting to see what white will do. And then the most common thing is this. And now, another subject to talk about when you're talking about what the best chess openings are, it's possible to transpose. And if you're not sure what transposition is for any of you beginners out there, that's basically when you start with one opening. So we've started out with the ready opening here. Developing this knight, attacking the center. Black continues with this. And now the most played move is c4. But now we see we've transposed into the English opening, which usually begins with c4. So we'll take a look at that next. And this is also, one of the best chess openings. So c4 is played, usually g6 is played next, then knight to c3. So if you're going to push the c pawn, usually it's a good idea to bring the knight in behind it, because now the pawn and the knight are really helping cover this d5 square. And it could be a battle raging there later in the game because this knight is covering that. If this pawn pushes forward, the queen will also cover that. And especially if a pawn is pushed here or here, then either one of these pawns could help fight for that valuable square in the center. And that's another strategy in the best openings in chess. They sometimes just target a very important square, and all the play will revolve around this very important square. And in this opening, it's this d5 square. So what is played most often next? Well, you brought this this pawn forward, and that usually means you intend to fianchetto the bishop here, and now it is aimed down through the center and at the queen side. So here, e4 is played most often, then d6, preventing this pawn from pushing forward and harassing the knight, and now d4. So if you can get two pawns in the center, even three pawns could be even better. But another thing I should mention is a good reason to learn general chess opening principles and general chess strategy is so that you would know if you push a lot of pawns in the center, and the more space you gain with these pawns, you want to avoid too many piece trades, because let's say you pushed all your pawns way up the board and then all the pieces are exchanged off except for the king. Well, it might be harder for your king to run up here and defend these pawns. Now, if there's just another king on the board, if you can get your king up there, it shouldn't be too bad. But if there are like rooks or a queen roaming around and your pawns are far advanced and you don't have a lot of other pieces to help back them up, it might be hard to defend them. All right, so the most often played move is castling. Then bishop to e2 and white's ready to castle. e5, that's ignored and castling is usually played. Knight to c6. White attacks and gains space. So as I mentioned before, you don't usually want to move a piece twice in the opening until you get your pieces off the back rank and get your rooks to good squares, unless there's a good reason. And you want moves to accomplish more than one thing. So the good reason here is that this pawn move accomplishes more than one thing. It gains space in the center. It attacks a valuable knight that was helping control the center and drives that knight back, retreating. And it gives you time to figure out what you want to do next. Now here, this is where knowing opening theory can really help, but it can be difficult to remember all this stuff. So we're 9 moves deep, and you might think, why is this knight retreating? It's not under attack. It's going back to the edge of the board, and the famous saying, knights on the rim are dim. Why would you do this? Well, this is where opening theory comes in. It's been determined over time that retreating the knight, allowing this pawn to push forward and attack the center, is usually a good move. So here, black does the same thing, retreating back, and then bishop is developed. We have f5 attacking the center, f3 helps defend the pawn, and f4 gaining space on the king side. So this is where opening theory, general principles come in. In the opening, usually the direction that your central pawns are pointing is the direction you want to attack in. And here, white, their central pawns on e4 and d5 are aiming at the queen side. So usually you want to attack in that direction by throwing your pawns there and jumping your pieces in behind them. So this c pawn could push forward at some point in the future, maybe after b4 is played. And now, if we look at black's central pawns, they're pointing from, they're pointing to the king side from d6 here and e5. So they're aiming down this way, and that's why this pawn is pushed forward. And the other pawns may start going forward as well to give room for an attack and have the pieces funnel in behind them. So we have bishop retreating to f2 here, and then g5, and now a4 is most often played. So now it's kind of a race where white is attacking on the queen side, black is attacking on the king side. So I'll play this out a few more moves. a5 gains a lot of space. The rook jumps forward, maybe giving room for the other knight to maneuver in here. And then finally, this c5 move is played, but the knight just captures, bishop captures, pawn captures. So at the moment, a pawn has been given up here. But let's see what usually occurs after that. The pawn is normally blocked, aiming at the king and the rook here, so that's a threat. Look out for those tactics. All the more reason to study your tactics. Oh, excuse me. And then we have a minority attack here, where we have a smaller number of pawns attacking a larger number of pawns. So this single pawn attacks. Usually it is captured, and then bishop drops back to d3, maybe helping avoid a trade of the queens here. And now what? It says there's no more games in the position, but anyway, this is one way the game could have gone. And if we look at this, it's more complicated, and this is what I was talking about. The best chess openings are really determined by what you find comfortable for your style. If you like maneuvering and closed games like this, you might enjoy these D pawn or queen pawn openings with D4. But if you, and well, we didn't even start with that, so excuse me. If I go back to the beginning here, E4 tends to be open. So coming out of the opening, you'll usually have more room to maneuver your pieces. Now, once you get into d4 or c4 or one of these knight moves, it's possible that the game could end up closed with more maneuvering and strategy involved. So we'll take a quick look at this c4 move, which is I believe it was the fourth most played opening. So normally, once again, knight to f6 is played. The knight is brought in behind the pawn. And then we have what? g6 and g3 here. So fianchetto of both bishops. And then castling quickly for black. And this is another thing that might determine what you think the best chess opening is. If you like something like this that gets your king quickly castled to safety, and then after your king is safe, then you can start worrying about what to do with your pieces and pawns, well, you might play in this manner. But, there's always a possibility that giving up your hand early by castling that quickly, now your opponent knows where to aim his pieces, and he could just start marching up pawns and pieces and attacking your king because it's castled early. But you should have plenty of time to fight him off. In the game, e4 is most often played, then d6. The knight develops and white is ready to castle. c5 helping control the center. Castling. The knight jumps up here. d3, and there could be an outpost on d4. So another reason to know general chess strategy is so you can learn about outposts and how valuable they are. An outpost can be a place where you can position a piece here where other pawns cannot attack it. Now, at the moment, if this knight jumps up here, white's knight could capture, the pawn could capture. So most often played as this to keep the knight from jumping forward. Maybe in the future getting ready to push an attack here. h3, preventing pieces from landing on g4 here, giving the king a little more extra room. And now rook to b8. So one of the ways to determine the best chess openings is if you're able to find good spots to place your rooks. If you don't have open files or half open files because no pawns have been traded, well then you can place your rooks behind pawns that you plan to push forward. So here, there's the opportunity to push this pawn up to b5 and it's backed up by the rook. So a4 is usually played to stop that. The knight retreats back. White continues development. Knight jumps over to help cover this. And now we have d4. So capture of a more valuable central pawn by a less valuable flank pawn. Knight recaptures. Knight to e6. Now the knight retreats back, avoiding trades. And then we have knight to c5 here. So now rook to b1. Maybe white is preparing to push a pawn in the future itself or fight for this b file if things open up. Oh, wrong move. Knight to b4, b3, and bishop to d7. So black is just trying to continue development. The queen has moved off the back rank. The rooks are connected, which is usually something you want to accomplish coming out of the opening. And finally, some conflict here on the queen side. You could capture, but most played only 2 times here, and white won both of these games. He ignored that and just continued development. So both of white's rooks are in a good position, and he's ahead in development. The queen still needs developed by black, and this other rook is not doing much here. So Normally this is played threatening the pawn, but that's ignored with a capture over here. Capture, and now the capturing continues, and the bishop pair is taken. And now what? Knight up to d4, jumping forward closer to black's position, attacking the rook, which retreats, and then bishop to a6, trying to exchange off here. So capture, queen captures and guards this pawn, but that doesn't matter because there's no longer a queen bishop battery attacking. Anyway, another example of how things could go. All right, well, the best chess openings, I'll wrap this up. What is the best chess opening? Well, I think it just really depends on your playing level and your playing style. The more you learn, the more advanced your chess becomes, the deeper you can go into openings and opening theory. But in the beginning, if you're a beginner, you want to play things that are a little bit more simple. And a good piece of advice is to just pick one good opening with white, one good opening with black, and then on the side you could experiment with other openings, and definitely go over some chess master games from the greatest chess players. And if you see a player that you really like their style and you like the openings you play, well, then you can try out some of their openings and see if it suits your style. But remember, chess masters are at such a higher level than regular and especially beginning players that sometimes they play things that are more complicated. So the best chess openings for you could be, picking some of the second and third most played moves. So if we go to e4, and then e5 is the second most played move, and then here we'll pick the first or the most played move. Well, now this is most played, and if we look at the position here, the Ruy Lopez is played most often, but that can be a more complicated opening. For beginners, usually bishop to c4 is played. That has a lot of attacking possibilities, lining up on this f pawn, which is only protected by the king. And beginners may be able to handle this opening a little bit easier, but it can get complicated and have some crazy attacking possibilities. And if you are not comfortable in a more tactical game, I would recommend studying tactics more. So if a game is steered into crazy tactics, you can still handle them. But you might want to start with a d4 pawn opening. Now here, the third most played move is this, the Scotch game. So this might be something that's a little less complicated for you. You immediately put both your pawns in the center, so usually black is going to capture. You recapture, now you're attacking the knight, threatening to capture and maybe double the pawns. Black ignores that, immediately attacking your central pawn. So usually capture is played, and then capturing towards the center, another general piece of chess strategy. They could capture away from the center and keep all their pawns together, because now there's an isolated pawn here. So just remember to factor in tactics and strategy, even right off in the opening. So because that'll dictate how the rest of the game is going to go coming out of the opening. E5 can be played here, but the queen pins that to the king. So the pin is broken by the queen developing, forcing this knight to move. The knight is attacked, but that can be ignored by a pin of this pawn on the queen. So even here we see some tactics developing. B3 protects the pawn that was unprotected here. And now g6, getting ready to add another attacker to this pawn. So f4 is played to protect the pawn. The bishop adding pressure, but now it's backed up by the f pawn. And finally, queen to f2, getting the queen out of this possible pin here. Knight drops back. And this also blocks the scope of the queen, which could try and capture this pawn whenever this rook has to move. So bishop attacks the queen. Queen just moves forward, but now black can't castle to the king side. White develops. We have d6. White castles to the queen side. And now black is able to castle. So knight jumps forward. c5 blocks the scope of the bishop. And now we have the knight attacking. So the queen drops back. Bishop develops. Knight up to d7. And capture, leaving black with a backward pawn on a half-open file. The rook develops attacking the queen. Queen retreats. And the bishop fights for this long diagonal. That is blocked. And this is where, I guess, the database ended here, apparently. All right, but you get the idea. Another example. So, once again, trying to wrap this up. What are the best chess openings? Well, they're the ones that you feel the most comfortable in, that you can develop your pieces quickly, get your king to safety quickly, and it depends on your playing level. If you're a beginner, you want to play something that's a little bit less complicated. And as you progress in your chess abilities, you can try something a little more difficult. So take a look at master games and see if you can find a chess master who plays openings that complement your playing style or that look interesting to you. You might not even know what your playing style is yet. So if an opening looks interesting and you like how the moves are played and the pieces developed, try it out, and it might suit your style or help you develop your own chess style. All right, well, feel free to leave any comments. What do you think is the best chess opening? What is your favorite chess opening? Feel free to leave comments. Like and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.